mass surveillance and data extraction technology from Israeli companies that are close to the Israeli government to access our personal data. That is a part of the boomerang. And that alone should, I think that should terrify everybody who lives in the United States.
Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Mary Mattei. Thanks for being here. Our website is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. On this week's show, Katie talks to Craig Mokhiber. He is a human rights lawyer, resigned from a senior position at the UN in protest of the Gaza genocide.
And we talk about Israel, we talk about Venezuela, we talk about ICE, we talk about the connections between all of these things. And we speak about Gaza because Gaza is no longer getting as much attention as it deserves because there's so many other things that are understandably taking up the news and the headlines. And also, let's be honest, even when there weren't those things, Gaza wasn't getting sufficient coverage. So I make sure that I also talk to him about Gaza. And we also talk about the imperial boomerang.
At a time of so much lawlessness, Trump kidnapping the president of Venezuela, threatening to bomb Iran, defending the ICE murder of Rene Good, you have to ask yourself, what about the law? And it's great to hear from someone like Craig Mokhiber, who's an expert in something called the law, which we're all forgetting, foremost, of course, in the Gaza genocide. And it's like, there should be a remake. That song, Where's the Love by the Black Eyed Peas, also by Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack. We could do a remake called Where's the Law?
Where is the law? Yeah.
Where's the law? Yeah.
Very good.
But first, we do a weekly recap segment called the Friday Free for All. It's for our paid subscribers. But if you're a free subscriber, here is a free preview. As of this broadcast, Trump has not bombed Iran. Looks like he's pulled back on his threats. And someone who I think is probably the most disappointed person in the world at this news is career war hawk Lindsey Graham. And this is his reaction.
There are a lot of headlines out there that are, in my view, not accurate. President Trump's resolve is not the question. The question is, when we do an operation like this, should it be bigger or smaller? I'm in the camp of bigger. Time will tell. I'm hopeful and optimistic that the regime days are numbered.
I've never seen him so somber. He's usually on TV so giddy because he thinks Trump is about to fall through on Lindsey Graham's latest neoconservative wish list. But since he hasn't bombed yet, Lindsey Graham strikes me as being kind of dejected.
I mean, I just hope someone is checking in on Lindsey Graham, his friends, family, loved ones, because he does not seem to be in a good place. He has post not bomb stress disorder.
Well, you know what he's done to get himself into a better place? He's actually announced that he's flying off to Israel to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu.
So what's needed? That's exactly what you need at a time like this.
Yeah, it's like his mutual support network. And they're going to plot how to get moving on this whole Iran regime change thing. And look, if history is any guide, I think they have a very strong chance at actually convincing Trump ultimately to follow through on the bombing that he hasn't done yet.
I guess I'm wrong, Aaron, because I said his friends and family and loved ones should check in on Lindsey Graham, but he seems actually to be in a good place because, a part of self-care is making sure that you're surrounding yourself with friends and loved ones when you're in a trying time. And he, by going to Israel, shows us that he actually is pretty, he's taking care of himself in this hard time.
All right. Well, these protests in Iran, what were they about? They were about the severe depreciation of the Iranian currency and inflation, which is a major problem. And there's no doubt that inside Iran, government corruption and mismanagement is a real thing. And that's what people are angry about. It doesn't help, though, that the U.S., the world's most powerful government, is imposing the harshest sanctions on the world that are very carefully designed by teams of very highly educated, experienced bureaucrats to cause economic pain and to cut Iran off from the global economy. How is the Trump administration responding to Iran's economic misery? By announcing a brand new set of sanctions and bragging about the misery that they've caused the people of Iran. Here is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
My message today is to the Iranian leadership on behalf of the people of Iran who cannot.
So first of all, again, this guy who is a millionaire American cabinet official is now claiming to speak on behalf of the people of Iran, which is strange in itself. But then listen to what his message is.
But I also think he should just swap out. If all he has to do, Aaron, is if he just put on like an Iran lapel pin instead of the American one, I think he'd be actually in business.
He'd also have to lose the collar too, because Iranian men generally don't wear a collar on their dress shirts, in my experience.
Speak for themselves. Last March, we predicted that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime would accelerate an economic collapse. Since then, our sanctions...
So you hear that? We predicted that our sanctions would accelerate an economic collapse. So he's bragging about collapsing Iran's economy, which again, for all the Iranians who have legitimate grievances with their government and who protest the government, I don't think they want their economy to collapse. In fact, what they were protesting was the collapse of their economy. Scott Bessent think that's a good thing.
This is just the go-to, right? This is like, our government is so entitled and out of whack and immoral that they don't even know that they shouldn't be saying this stuff out loud.
Sanctions efforts have been effective in slashing oil exports and cutting revenue. The currency and living conditions are in freefall. The early warning signs are already flashing in the Iranian economy.
So he's bragging again, just that the Iranian economy is in a free fall. And he's talking about all this as if this is a positive thing.
Well, it's funny because, if you could take that same speech and turn it into like an Iran pro-government Iran speech, if you had Iranian politicians saying like, the economy is in free for all because of American sanctions, because of U.S. sanctions.
Exactly. Like the government, when it wants to deflect all responsibility, what they will say is, this is because of America.
Exactly.
Right? And then Scott Bessent is proving their point. Now, look, in fairness, the government does have a point in that this turmoil would not be happening without U.S. sanctions, but that doesn't absolve them of their mismanagement and the corruption, which, from what I know, is a very, very real thing. And that's why people were out there protesting. But Scott Bessent is doing the Iranian government's work for it by basically saying that we deserve a lot of credit for causing such a crash.
And there is obviously government repression. I say that as a citizen of the United States, where there is a lot of violence, government violence, repression, and crackdown. But again, that doesn't absolve... that neither absolves the U.S. of what it's doing, nor does it justify regime change.
All right. Well, speaking of regime change, someone who was on CNN talking about the prospect of regime change is Oklahoma Senator Mark Wayne Mullin, the guy with two first names.
He had some interesting things to say on CNN about regime change and Iran. Let's take a listen.
And to see the rest of our Friday Free for All, where we cover topics including the rollout of Trump's so-called great healthcare plan, which, just spoiler alert, is not a plan. It's really just another scam. And the latest in the Trump administration's cover-up of the murder of Renee Good, and the most ghoulish comment that Mike Pompeo has ever made. And trust me, that is tough competition.
Yeah, it really is.
Go to usefulidiospodcast.com.
And as promised, here is my interview with the wonderful Craig Mokhiber, human rights lawyer, former human rights official at the UN who resigned over the UN's failure to act to stop the genocide in Gaza. And we talk about everything ranging from Iran to Venezuela to Israel to Minneapolis to the Imperial Boomerang. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Craig Mokhiber.
Thank you, Katie. Always nice to be with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I should say coming back on the show because you are a major friend of show. Wanted to ask you about a recent article that you had that kind of ties together so much of what we're seeing in Palestine, Venezuela, now in places like Minneapolis. And it's called Ushering in the Age of Impunity, Venezuela, Palestine, and the End of International Law. And the sub-headline is, the recent sound of explosions over Venezuela, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and Nigeria are not merely the spasms by a declining U.S. empire. They are something much more terrifying, the dawning of the age of impunity. Can you talk about what you mean by that? And this is an article, by the way, that you wrote at the excellent Mondo Weiss.
Yeah, I was triggered to write the article by what happened on January 3rd when, the U.S., without provocation, and just blatantly, unlawfully bombed Venezuela, invaded its capital, killed dozens of people, and then violently abducted its president and first lady and dragged them off in chains to the United States for a politicized trial. And that act in itself, as shocking as it was to me not as shocking by the very weak response of leaders of other governments, of international institutions, and others who, and certainly the very complicit response of U.S. corporate media, politicians in the U.S., including in the Democratic Party, who all just treated it as if it was a somewhat controversial law enforcement operation, when in fact it was a blatant violation of a whole raft of international laws, some of the most serious laws in international law. And we heard barely a whimper in response to that. And what I was arguing in this article was that is an indication of where we are in ushering in this new age of impunity, where there are no constraints remaining of what had been constructed since the Second World War in international law, in international institutions, and that this wasn't something that had just happened overnight. And it wasn't just a spasm of the US empire at this moment in history, but it's an indication of a new world that is being born, or I said perhaps reborn, because it's very reminiscent of some of the horrors that we saw in the first half of the 20th century before all of these international laws and institutions were adopted. And this is the new age of impunity, I had argued there, where there are no more red lines. And why? Because even if genocide is not a red line, as we have seen for over 2 years now, with genocide in Palestine that is just not only being tolerated, but supported by so many in power around the world. If even genocide is not a red line, there are no red lines. And the United States and its partner, Israel, have recognized there are no red lines, and they are behaving accordingly. And that is a very dangerous moment in history, I think, for all of us. And I think, you can in the piece, I go back and I track the step-by-step process of pushing the envelope of international law more and more and more, both domestically in the United States, on areas under control of the Israeli regime, and then more broadly internationally by this, what I've called the U.S.-Israel axis, and this gradual, actually downward spiral of lawlessness that we have been witnessing, especially over the course of the last 2 years, but going back really for decades now, where you can look at what happened during the so-called war on drugs, which was just a kind of bald rejection of any legal principles, mass incarceration, racial profiling, persecution of particular communities, especially those living in poverty, really abusive sentences and so on. And because they got away with that, we shouldn't have been surprised after September 11th of 2001 in the United States, when the so-called war on terrorism was launched, which was just a blanket abdication from any constraints of international law, where the new message was that torture is okay, renditions and kidnapping are okay, extrajudicial executions are okay, the crime of aggression against independent countries is okay. All of that, all of those guardrails were wiped away then with the war on drugs, and then you can take that, all the way down the spiral of destruction that we've been witnessing, where the U.S.-Israel axis has been perpetrating genocide in Palestine, serial aggression against a half a dozen countries in Western Asia, executions, assassinations all across the region, transnational terror attacks with the use of booby-trap pagers in Lebanon, attacking humanitarian convoys and flotillas in the Mediterranean Sea, one atrocity after another, including the two cardinal rules of the international legal system established after World War II that say that the two things that are never tolerated are, one, aggression, And yet we've witnessed that over and over again. Just in the last year, the U.S. has attacked 7 countries under Donald Trump's watch. And the other one, genocide, which has not only been tolerated, but enthusiastically supported by the United States government, by U.S.-based corporations, by the corporate media, and by Western governments from the United Kingdom to Germany and beyond. That's the new age in which we are entering. A piece of that is the story of impunity. Another is the imperial boomerang that we've discussed before, where the kinds of atrocities that have been perpetrated abroad by the U.S.-Israel axis are now coming home to countries in the West to persecute people in our own communities.
Yeah, I want to ask you to expand upon the imperial boomerang. It's a term that gets used a lot, but I think it's useful to actually kind of drill down into what it means, where it comes from, and how specifically it applies to the present moment.
Well, the imperial boomerang is a phrase that's used to describe this phenomenon where, the abuses of colonialism that are practiced abroad against the Algerians, against the Vietnamese, against the Palestinians, against the Haitians and others, that the abuses that are perpetrated there inevitably come back home to the countries responsible for that colonialism. And they come back in the form of, effectively, of fascism. The idea that governments using repressive and developing repressive techniques in colonial territories, eventually they're going to apply those same techniques to their own citizens. I know this is going to be really resonating with people watching the show right now because it's become so familiar in the last couple of years. It was Aimé Césaire, who was a Black writer and thinker from Martinique in 1950, who published his discourse on colonialism. And he used the language of reverse shock or terrific boomerang to explain how European fascism, which was such a shock to the Western world, was not such a shock to people living in the global South, that those were the sorts of horrors that the West had been perpetrating on people of the global South, on colonized people for decades and decades and decades in the first half of the 20th century and beyond. This idea of Aimé Césaire's on this imperial boomerang, this was also picked up by Hannah Arendt in her Origins of Totalitarianism a little while later, where both of them pointed out that these methods that were used by Hitler and the Nazis, they were not as unique as the Western history likes to say that they are. What was unique about them is that they were being used against Europeans. They were being used against white people. And that was the shock to the system. But all of those horrific practices and tactics were used first by the West against colonized peoples in the global South for centuries, and causing the deaths of tens of millions of people. Right. And so those things were familiar: racial hierarchies, mass surveillance, forced labor, ultimately genocide. All of those things had been systematically practiced against the peoples of the South by Western colonial governments, and then brought home, which is what brought us the horrors of that happened during the Second World War, including the Holocaust and the other atrocities that were perpetrated. And we see it now as well, right? The militarization of police forces across the United States, including ICE, by the way, that comes from practices that have been tested on brown bodies, in the global South and in Palestine and beyond. The use of militarized police in response to political protest in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and so on, these horrific images we've been seeing, especially for the past 2 years, that comes from practices against colonized peoples elsewhere in the world. The U.S. developed many of its counterinsurgency techniques when it was colonizing the Philippines very brutally. The horrors that it perpetrated on the Filipino people in its colonization, it then used those techniques, some of them for repression back at home. And so you have the importing of brutal U.S. tactics that they used in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Syria. You have soldiers who participated in the unlawful invasion of Iraq and unlawful wars around the world, then bringing those tactics home and joining law enforcement. All of this is a part of the imperial boomerang. And then we can talk more, if you want, about a particular piece of this, which is the Zionist boomerang, which is, what is coming out of all of the experimentation on Palestinian bodies by the Israeli regime. But that's the one we're seeing most especially now in the United States.
Can you talk about the Israeli regime's nefarious role in Latin America, as you referred to it during an interview the other day with Atlanta Radio?
Yeah, well, it's a long story. The history of the Israeli regime supporting far right governments and death squads and forces in Latin America, and attacking or supporting attacks on progressive governments and progressive movements in the region. And that's why in her first address after the U.S. attacked Venezuela, the vice president, who's now the interim president, Delcy Rodríguez, she said that the attack on the country had Zionist undertones, was the phrase that she used. And she didn't elaborate on that, but people of the region are well aware that the hand of the Israeli regime in supporting right-wing forces, destabilizing progressive governments in the region has been going on forever. And here we're talking about Israeli weapons, Israeli equipment, Israeli surveillance technology, Israeli intelligence cooperation, spying on opposition and so on. Israeli training, which is a kind of indoctrination that's been very dangerous for Latin America and, by the way, for the US. And then also influence via Israel proxy organizations in the region. These have been a constant feature of the struggle, especially between left and right in the country. But what's really sometimes missed in these conversations is that the Israeli regime has been exporting not just weapons and technology and tactics, which is bad enough, with its junkets to Israel and its training and so on, not just Latin America police, but U.S. police and others. But it also exports a kind of violent and racist ideology. Very ideas that are very right-wing, very Zionist, very militarist, very anti-human rights in their essence and in their tactics. Obviously deeply anti-Muslim and anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian and anti-left. And this general idea that tries to frame law enforcement as equivalent of military. And of course, the idea that the targets of law enforcement are not just, citizens of the country, but they are the enemy, and that the people in their gun sites are terrorists, and as such, they're not entitled to human rights. That has been a big part of it. And that's why you see, Katie, that after the attack by the U.S. on Venezuela, Israeli regime leaders were absolutely giddy, celebrating the attacks on Venezuela and the abduction of the Venezuelan president, which is something that they had been hoping for since, the Bolivarian Revolution and the rise to power of Hugo Chavez. And, so this is the first piece of it, is that kind of influence. Why
does Israel care about what happens in Venezuela? Why are they threatened by the Bolivarian Revolution?
Well, the biggest, there are a couple of things here. One is that, the progressive governments in Latin America have always been in solidarity with the Palestinian people and with their human rights and freedom struggle in Palestine. And that's in sharp contrast to right-wing forces and right-wing governments that are very closely aligned with the Israeli regime and continuously pledge stronger and stronger collaboration. So they have a dog in the fight, as it were, and so they're very much invested in that as well. There's also this long tradition of alignment, right? The Israeli regime has backed up oppressive forces in Latin America, virtually forever. It supplied arms and aircraft and surveillance to right-wing regimes in Argentina and Brazil and Guatemala, in El Salvador, helped to fight against leftist insurgencies there. Together with the U.S., by the way. You had the Mossad and Israeli firms that for decades have trained death squads and secret police and military units in counterinsurgency tactics and the dirty wars that happened in Guatemala and El Salvador. When the U.S. stopped providing, imposed an arms embargo on the far-right dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile or the junta in Argentina, Israel stepped in to continue to provide that military hardware, obviously with the agreement of the United States that was providing the loans to Israel to make this happen. You had Israeli support for military dictatorships and dirty wars in Argentina and Brazil and Paraguay and Chile, training of military units in Colombia. It goes on and on and on in all of these cases. So it's a long relationship that continues into Venezuela. Because in Venezuela, the opposition, people like Maria Machado, have pledged absolute fanatical loyalty to the Israeli regime, even during the genocide, cheering it on and so on. Well, Maduro and Chavez before him have called out the Israeli regime for its crimes. And if you look at what got Venezuela into the gun sights of the U.S.-Israel axis, right? They have oil, which is coveted by U.S. corporations, which they insist on using for the benefit of their own people. They have refused to submit to U.S. hegemony in the region, and they have openly opposed the crimes of the Israeli regime. Look at all of the countries that have fallen under U.S. gun sights in recent years, whether that is in Iraq or Libya or in Iran, and you will see they all have these things in common. But there's one more thing that makes it particularly important to the U.S.-Israel axis, which is that, their planning of attacks, which have already begun in one form or another on Iran, is challenging for them because Iran, one, has oil, and two, it controls the Straits of Hormuz and therefore global energy markets, right? And they view Venezuela as what analysts call a hedging strategy, that if they can have access and control of Venezuelan oil, they can help to counteract the leverage of Iran by being able to control the Straits of Hormuz and its own oil production, and therefore strengthen their hand and their impunity in attacking the Iranian regime. All of those pieces have come together both in the attack on Venezuela and in the shenanigans going on against Iran right now.
And what about Israel's role in U.S. crackdowns against its own citizens?
Yeah, this is what I refer to as the Zionist boomerang, right? This support for Zionism, fascism, apartheid, all of the crimes of the Israeli regime in Palestine. And then more broadly, it first spread to the rest of Western Asia. And so it's not just Palestinians who are suffering under Israeli bombs and bullets, but it's Lebanese, it's Syrians, it's Yemenis, it's Iraqis, it's Iranians, and so on. But now it's come back to our own cities. And especially in the tactics that come out of the joint U.S.-Israeli project of repression in Palestine. We're talking about policing tactics that are entirely inconsistent with international human rights standards, right? So you've got decades of the U.S. that's been underwriting apartheid and surveillance and repression and genocide in Palestine. Those practices are now being brought home, which we've seen in the brutal persecution of student protesters in our cities, others who have been standing up to oppose the horrors of the Israeli regime. You see it in the distortion of U.S. legislation by Israel and its government-adjacent proxies in the U.S., the official adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, an Israeli tool to try to silence dissent about Israeli abuses. You see it in the wholesale suspension of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in the U.S. on behalf of not of the U.S. government or any other government in the world, but on behalf of the Israeli regime. And the criminalization of speech that's critical of the Israeli regime, the proscribing of BDS, which is a right under the U.S. Constitution to boycott and to divest and to call for sanctions and to speak out against the regime. So this distortion of legislation and even of the Constitution in the U.S., which is this massive wave of repression that we have been witnessing, this is blowback from support for Zionism in Western Asia. And you see it especially beyond all of this in the corruption of U.S. law enforcement, with this continuous structured flow of Israeli weapons and equipment and surveillance technology and intelligence and training and influence and so on. This technology that I said is notorious for its brutal and abusive use on Palestinians, militarized tactics that have been universally condemned in the rest of the world, tactics that are not designed for civilian protection or law enforcement, but really for killing and maiming. A lot of these things come out of Israel's so-called counterterrorism tactics. And whenever you hear that word counterterrorism, I think we've all learned, human rights runs for cover. It's surveillance, it's brutal crowd control techniques, racial profiling, intrusive intelligence gathering that's now, touching all of us. That is a product of this Zionist boomerang as well. Mass surveillance and data extraction technology from Israeli companies that are close to the Israeli government to access our personal data. That is a part of the boomerang. And that alone I think that should terrify everybody who lives in the United States. But as I said, Israel is exporting not just weapons and technology and tactics, but it's also exporting this violent, racist, extremely right-wing, very militarist and anti-human rights ideology, and with it, the racism that comes with it, and the idea that the targets of law enforcement are the enemy. That they're terrorists and so on. So, and one more thing I'll say about this, this is all paid for by U.S. tax dollars, and it's organized by Israel regime proxy groups. I mean, one of the most horrific aspects of this story is that this collaboration between law enforcement in the U.S. and the Israeli regime, it's organized by Israel proxy groups operating in the United States, like, surprise, surprise, the Anti-Defamation League, JINSA, which is the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the American Jewish Committee, AIPAC's charitable organization, Birthright Israel, and so on. They get the money from the U.S. government to organize this collaboration that is indoctrinating police forces and ICE. And by the way, DHS and ICE both have Israel offices in Israel, also paid for by U.S. tax dollars. And so as of today, thousands of U.S. law enforcement officials, especially the most senior ones, high-ranking ICE, Border Patrol, FBI executives, thousands of them have traveled to Israel since the early 2000s and received this kind of indoctrination. And you won't be surprised to hear that Cop City outside of Atlanta, which has been so criticized as this laboratory for human rights abuse outside of Atlanta in Georgia, is also closely associated with the Israeli regime, supported by pro-Israel billionaires and corporate backers, and a longtime collaborator directly with the regime and its law enforcement exchanges. And that it was, in fact, Israel that created the model for Cop City with a kind of mini Gaza that they built inside Israel for the regime to practice attacking Palestinians. This is the boomerang that has been inflicted on people of the South, in this case, especially the Palestinians, and has now come home to attack the human rights of people right here in the U.S.
It's interesting because I think we're used to, and hopefully not immune to, and not numbed by the racial profiling that we see the police state commit so frequently with so much impunity. But I think some people were shocked by the killing of Renee Good because she's a white woman. And so now there has to be a different kind of vilification. So for instance, when Black men are killed or Black young men or Black boys are killed, they're no angels, right? They're some sort of thug or criminal. But now you see the media saying stuff like this about Renee Good. The woman killed by an ICE agent in Minneapolis last week served on the board of her son's school, which linked to documents encouraging parents to monitor ICE and directing them to training. That's a tweet from CNN, and the headline is "New Documents Shed Light on Renee Good's Ties to ICE Monitoring Efforts in Minneapolis." And as the great journalist Prem Tucker points out on Twitter, this is unbelievable framing. Can you talk about this?
Well, obviously, long before law enforcement in the U.S. was thoroughly corrupted by this kind of ideology, the U.S. corporate media already was. And, you and I have spoken so many times before about the active role of U.S. media corporations, including CNN, in disseminating propaganda for genocide in Palestine. And the media has played that role domestically for years as well. It's very much, and you see this in the sort of MAGA response to what happened to Renee Good, that this kind of othering is the very essence of it. Is their value. It is othering, right? You're not going to be impressed by human rights norms and standards or even constitutional principles. It is othering. And so now this is a white person who has suffered the colonial boomerang, and what that means by these militarized, what I have called brown shirts, because they are not only a kind of a rogue agency, but they are also ideologically driven, and they have a line of loyalty that goes directly to Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and, all of these nefarious characters as well. So now it comes back and it's a white person. How do you tell that story? You have to other that person. And so we've seen media representations and Republican politicians and others pointing just matter-of-factly to the fact that she's a woman, she's a lesbian, she's of the left. She's
has pronouns in her bio.
Right. She's presumed to be of the left. She's right. So that this is all a way to other. And this comes out of this ideology that, things like law enforcement, there's not even a pretense of the purpose of these bodies, especially ICE, of being sort of service to the community, or to protect and serve, and all of those old cliches. This is a partisan armed force, which is carrying out an ideological campaign. And, anyone who thought that there was any moment in history where CNN was some progressive force in our society, I think they've learned over the course of the last couple of years that that is not the case. It is a corporate force. It is a deeply chauvinistic, very militaristic, very Zionist in its orientation, and it tells news stories that are consistent with that approach. And at the center of all of this is that great curse on humanity, which is the concept of the other, and especially this trick that, again, we've witnessed coming out of Israel for the past a couple of years so often, of blaming the victim. So the bad guy, one way or another, is not going to be the thug who executed a U.S. citizen in cold blood. It will be the victim. It's her fault. She's a bad person.
And we even saw the disturbing parallel between what Israel does and what ICE did, where they blocked medical aid. There was apparently a doctor near the Renee Good shooting who wanted to access her to give her medical care, and he was denied access. And we've seen this time and time again in Israel. And that's one parallel. Another parallel is when Israel is questioned, their politicians or representatives will say things like, "How dare you? That's anti-Semitism. Shame on you," because they can't actually engage in the criticism. And we saw a similar discourse coming particularly from J.D. Vance. Shame on you. How dare the media tell these lies? And it is a really creepy parallel, but of course it's not surprising, especially given that I guess we should thank the U.S. politicians and Israeli politicians who brag about the shared values between the U.S. and Israel, because I guess we do have those values in common.
I mean, sadly, that is the case. There are other parallels as well. You'll notice that whatever comes into these discussions is, international law, for example. There are international standards for the use of force and firearm by law enforcement officials. There are other parallels here as well. One of them is the absolute disregarding of any international law or international standards. There are international standards for the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials in these situations. None of that comes into play. It becomes a matter of opinion, right? So if you support ICE, then what the guy did was justified. If you don't, it wasn't, as if there are no standards. There are standards. And, we see this with the Israeli regime, and by the way, colonial forces everywhere, all the time, where it's not about any set of norms and standards. It's about us versus them. And so anything can be justified. You also see it with the sort of encouragement of impunity, right? So every time you see an Israeli war crime against humanity, or atrocity, the Israeli regime doubles down behind it and says, this is perfectly okay, and we encourage our people to do these things effectively. And what have we seen from the Trump administration was, direct encouragement from Stephen Miller, from Donald Trump, and from others, Kirsty Noem, for these rogue forces of ICE to continue to conduct themselves in this way. So the message that goes to the other ICE officials is, you will enjoy absolute impunity. Carry on. This is what we want you to do. And this is very much the experience of people living under colonialism. There are no laws that are designed to protect you. The law, the institutions, the government, those are all for those who are oppressing you, but not for you.
It's really interesting because you see yet another parallel, which is this, what are they supposed to do framing? And you hear that coming from people who defend the Israeli regime. You hear that from people defending ICE. And part of the reason they can do that is because the media doesn't do its job, precisely does not talk about, well, here is what they can do, not only what they can do, what they need to do legally. And because they don't educate the public about whether it's international law or legal requirements within the United States, it really lends validity to the claims of the Israeli regime or to the ICE officer.
Yeah, absolutely. And this practice of ignoring international law is very convenient for those in power. Like we saw it just again with this Venezuela attack as well. No one in the corporate media was talking about legality. And if they were, they would talk about it in the sense that, don't you have to get approval from the Congress first? And
Right.
never pointing out that what was happening was a complex of international crimes that the U.S. was perpetrating. The sanctions were unlawful under international law, as my article explains. The U.S. supported coup attempts were unlawful in 2002, 2019, 2020. All of the covert CIA action in Venezuela that's been going on for decades is unlawful. Trump's murder of boaters in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, those were extrajudicial executions under international human rights law. The U.S. blockade on Venezuela is a violation of international law, and clearly so. The U.S. pirating of Venezuelan oil tankers was unlawful, an act of maritime aggression under the UN Charter and the law of the sea. The bombing and invasion and even the threats of further attacks, that's a violation of the UN Charter under Article 2.4. And then obviously the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, that's unlawful under the Charter, under human rights law that prohibits arbitrary arrest and detention, a violation of the legal principle of head of state immunity, the violence that was used during the abduction, the continued detention, the sharing of photos of the bound Maduro. This is unlawful under humanitarian law because it's an assault on the dignity of the prisoner. The use of sensory deprivation on Maduro with the earphones and the blinds and so on is a violation of international humanitarian law as well. And every day that they continue to be held in custody by the U.S. is a continuing violation of international human rights law because the arrest, the abduction in the first place, was unlawful. You will hear none of this from the U.S. media or even from the so-called opposition in the Democratic Party. This is the age of impunity I'm talking about. It is extended to countries outside the U.S., and now it's been brought home here as well, that the rule of law is over and we are not protected by the institutions of government or, presumed law, just as the rest of the world is not protected, as people in the, many countries attacked by the U.S.-Israel axis in the last 2 years have learned.
It's interesting because there has been a kind of meeting of minds when it comes to the left and the right, when it comes to international conflict or foreign policy. So I think you have people on the right and the left who both agree that what Israel's doing is wrong. And on the right, there's more, I think, of a sense of America first. On the left, it's more of a sense of these are just gross human rights violations. But there is some dovetailing. Similarly, when it comes to wars in the Middle East, invasions in the Middle East or strikes on Venezuela and Iran. But where you don't see this overlap is, for instance, when it comes to ICE. And I think that really we see how powerful the culture wars are and why culture wars are used as such a divisive wedge issue. Because I think you see people who are critical of government overreach usually. They see Renee Good and people like her as, threats to the social fabric. They see her as a, pronoun-using lesbian who is spying on ICE, which she wasn't. But how do you talk to these people who are, I would say, politically on the right and make the case to them that if they care about what the U.S. military is doing abroad, they also need to care about what ICE is doing here?
Well, it's a difficult conversation to have because people, the sort of fear and let's say it, racism that came in the post September 11th attacks, seized upon the hysteria of the moment and then has been cultivating that anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-people of color, all of that racism has been built more and more and more and has become thoroughly institutionalized in the United States, a country, let's face it, that was built on racism in the first instance with the extermination of the indigenous people, the enslavement of African peoples, the exploitation of migrant labor, and so on. It's a country that has a long tradition of racism. But what happened after September 11th was that this became institutionalized in an unprecedented level. So, most people who are debating ICE right now, younger people have no idea that ICE didn't exist before, 2003 or something like that, that it was a product of the post-September 11th hysteria when all kinds of erosions of our human rights were affected and institutionalized, including mass surveillance and and renditions and torture and spying on Americans and others, and the establishment of institutions like Homeland Security with its terrifying 1984 name. And the establishment of ICE. We didn't have ICE before then, and we didn't need ICE. We had something called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Doesn't that sound nice? A government agency that was purpose of service into an enforcement institution. And that institution, which has always been rogue compared to other bodies, has now been put on steroid by the Trump administration, which has funneled massive amounts of resources into it. It is now, by a wide measure, the largest and most well-funded law enforcement agency in the history of the world, more than any other law enforcement agency. And its budget dwarfs the military of most countries. And even more terrifying than that is that it has been given this blanket of impunity. I mean, masked, heavily armed, militarized thugs descending on American communities and perpetrating the kind of unrestrained violence that they do, that bears no resemblance to international standards for the use of force and firearms, or the U.S. Constitution or the laws of this country. And as I was saying before, the fact that they are effectively an ideological outfit. I've called them the brown shirts of the 21st century. And I think that is a fair analogy. They belong to Trump. They are extremely xenophobic. They are extremely thuggish in the way that they behave, very unprofessional.
And for people just listening, this is a tweet from Craig, and it's side by side with an image, a few images of ICE officers who are dressed. Most significantly, I have to say that the masking is just such a self-own. I mean, these are people who claim to be macho, fearless, courageous, and yet they can't show their faces. Many of them were people who argued against masks and masking and said they couldn't do their jobs before.
For public health reasons, yeah.
And then, these macho men are so secure in their masculinity that they have to shoot a woman 3 times in the head, who's literally driving her car in the opposite direction. But I just want to give you the chance to refer to this if you want to. But
well, they're masked because they know that what they're doing is not law enforcement. It will not have the support of the community. And you see communities revolting, which I think is a spark of light in a very dark age here. And so they're masked because they have been given this grant of impunity, of lawlessness by the administration. And now as individuals, they're wearing that impunity as a mask. I said in the tweet that they are not police, at least not police as they have evolved. And, police in the United States already operate under a much lower standard than law enforcement. A lot of other countries, evolved as they did from the slave patrols of earlier moments in U.S. history. But, those police are walking around with badges and nameplates and identifying themselves and, reading people their rights and presenting warrants. And, for all of the horrific problems we have had with law enforcement in this country, this is a new qualitative level of oppression that these people are operating just as armed gangs, effectively. And if they were armed gangs that were functioning only for economic gain or whatever, that would be one level of terror. But as I said, they are ideologically driven. They are part of the far right ideology of the current administration. They are loyal to Trump and his MAGA ideology. And I don't think there is any, there should be any more waiting for evidence of how dangerous these kinds of forces can be in society. They have to be dismantled. And when people say, well, that's crazy, defund kind of language, there was no ICE before 2003. And the situation was better. It was better. You didn't have communities being terrorized by these people and seeding violence. So that is a classic example of the imperial boomerang. Those are the of stormtroopers that people in colonized societies have to face every day of their life, dragged off without a warrant by a masked person, a masked gang, beaten and thrown into a dungeon without due process. That's the imperial boomerang in a series of photos.
And that's another example of where the media is so derelict. Like, God forbid they actually point out that ICE is a recent institution.
And just going along with the charade,
right?
So I mean, ICE was based upon a lie. In fact, much of debate about immigration in the United States is based upon this lie. It's based upon this false caricature that immigrants are criminals and racist and saps on the economy of the society. All of that is false, demonstrably so. It's been demonstrated over and over again that on net, migrants, including undocumented migrants, contribute more to the economy than they take out of it, that they are actually more law-respecting than the people, Native Americans who were born and raised here, that they, all of these are lies. And the media goes along with those lies as if there's this big, terrifying crisis. And it all, to me, it all was resolved. And the curtain was pulled back with one phrase from Donald Trump, who said very openly, why can't we have more people come here from Norway? Why does it have to come from these shithole countries?
Right.
Xenophobia is racism. That's all there is to it. And U.S. immigration policy has always been based on racism. The first immigration laws in this country were the Chinese Exclusion Act. Immediately, and since then we've seen the same things with Haitians and others. You have never seen the Norwegian Exclusion Act or the British Exclusion Act or whatever. This is racism, and the fact that media corporations in the U.S. play along with all of these tropes and actually work to justify the continuation of this very dangerous force called ICE in the United States tells you that they, where their bread is buttered, and it's not on the side of human rights.
I actually wanted to play a clip of a well-known racist, xenophobe, also just twerp. I don't know. I can't think of any other word to describe him. But of course, I'm speaking of Stephen Miller. And this is a video that is from Fox News. It's from October, but DHS retweeted it recently. Let's take a look at this.
To all ICE officers, you have federal immunity in the conduct of your duties. And anybody who lays a hand on you or tries to stop you or tries to obstruct you is committing a felony. You have immunity to perform your duties, and no one, no city official, no state official, no illegal alien, no leftist agitator or domestic insurrectionist can prevent you from fulfilling your legal obligations and duties. And the Department of Justice has made clear that if officials cross that line into obstruction, into criminal conspiracy against the United States or against ICE officers, then they will face justice.
So there you have it.
Yeah, this is the fascist éminence grise of the Trump administration, the man responsible for the blatantly fascist ideology of it. And here he is speaking directly, and there's a lot of things to be disgusted by in those words. But I think at the center of them is this very clear message that we've received again and again, that you have no rights, that the awesome power of the state is going to be unleashed against people in this country as it has been unleashed against people all around the world. And that if you resist, you are criminalized and you will suffer for it. And to those perpetrating these crimes, the ICE agents and others, the message is, you have absolute impunity. Go out there, wreak havoc. We've got your back. We'll make sure that you are not punished for it. It's what we want you to do. And so that all of a sudden, the international human rights law, the Constitution, legislation protecting civil rights, and so on, all of that is swept away. And the new message is, law or no law, international or domestic, we are the ones who hold the levers of power. And those levers of power will be used to advance our ideological agenda, to punish the other, and to empower our side of things. And so just remember that you don't have to be a criminal to go to jail anymore. You can be somebody asserting your human rights, and we will lock you up. And the person persecuting you, we will protect them because they're us. And that's where we are. And that's a perfect example. When Aimé Césaire first talked about this concept, saying effectively that fascism is colonialism that has come home, right? This is what he was talking about. And Stephen Miller is the poster boy of American fascism.
One thing I want to point out is that you've mentioned Imperial Boomerang and the illegality of the actions taken by the United States vis-a-vis Venezuela. But something that you may not be aware of is actually the true motives of the Trump administration in Venezuela. This is actually what the Department of Justice claims in a memo. One of the arguments that they're making to support their removal of Maduro, public reporting reflects that of a population of 28.8 million, over 20 million Venezuelans live in multidimensional poverty with inadequate access to food and essential medicines. Also, over 14 million of those individuals face severe humanitarian need, with medicines unavailable at 28.4% of pharmaceutical dispensaries and 5.1 million people facing hunger. Further, illegal mining has led to the displacement of indigenous communities and exacerbated issues involving child labor, including children as young as 7. So you may be surprised to know that was actually why they had to remove Maduro. Because who will speak for the child laborers and indigenous communities victimized by mining?
Yeah, it's amazing to me, this mill that they have to generate excuses for their lawlessness. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. We saw it obviously in Iraq, where they're still looking for their weapons of mass destruction. You know, they will change the pretext over and over again and hope that something sticks. But I don't think anyone is fooled by this. People were not fooled by the fabricated claim that, you know, Maduro was some kind of drug lord, which is absolute nonsense and has no basis in fact. They tried to accuse him of being the head of the cartel of the sun, and then had to ultimately admit that there is no such organization and that it was a concept made up by the CIA in the first case. Then they charged him with possession of machine guns, a man who is the head of a national army, and, you know, trying to extend U.S. gun laws. By the way, the country in the world that is the most awash with guns of all kinds, over which the U.S. has no jurisdiction whatsoever about who has a gun in Venezuela. And now you're seeing them trying to weaponize human rights, just as they're trying to do in Iran. So, you know, the U.S., which is responsible at this moment in history for the most systematic violation of human rights in the world, on the planet, both here in the United States and globally, is trying to weaponize human rights claims to justify violations of international law that, by the way, it is implicated in. So, you know, the Venezuelan economy, you might want to mention that the Venezuelan economy has been tanked by U.S. sanctions and U.S. interference now for years and years and years. And the same thing with the Iranian people suffering under the yoke of unlawful U.S. sanctions. So this idea that the U.S. violates international law, and in the act of violating international law says it's doing it because the other side is violating international law because they're suffering the consequences imposed on them by the U.S. This is where this kind of ideology comes full circle. And, you know, I recently did a podcast with Rania Khalek in which I concluded our discussion on this terrible practice on the part of the U.S. and others to weaponize human rights by, you know, quoting Will Smith and saying, you know, keep human rights out of your effing mouth, because this does so much harm to the cause of human rights. It's not fooling anybody except apparently the corporate media in the United States. And it's distracting from the fact that the real perpetrator here is the United States government and its allies.
And one thing I just wanted to make sure we mentioned, because I think it's unfortunately being ignored and eclipsed by other terrible news, is that Israel is still killing people in Gaza. What can you tell us about the latest that is coming out of that area that has been ignored, of course, by the media, or has received kind of tacit approval by the media?
Well, you know, there has been a massive distraction strategy going on in the form of a ceasefire that is not a ceasefire. So the so-called Trump ceasefire has not seen the Israelis ceasing fire for one single day. Ever since the ceasefire has been declared, Israel has continued its genocide. It's continued murdering Palestinians in the hundreds and hundreds. It's continued destroying Palestinian structures in their thousands in this continued wave of ethnic cleansing and total erasure of the Palestinian people undergoing this genocide. It has continued to block essentials of food and medicine and shelter every single day of the so-called ceasefire. The only side that is ceasefiring is the Palestinian resistance. And yet, every day you will hear, when the distraction technique allows some discussion of what's happening in Palestine, you will hear that there is this ceasefire in place, and the second lie, that there is a peace process in place. There is no peace process. There is an imperial dictate by Donald Trump with a few collaborators that are pretending that there is a peace process in place. It has looked at none of the root causes. It has done nothing to advance the human rights of the Palestinian people. It has done nothing to hold the Israelis responsible for perpetrating genocide. It has done nothing to bring redress to the survivors of the genocide, and it promises no opportunity at all for any kind of a peace. What's happening in Palestine now is the same thing that was been happening in Palestine a year ago and 2 years ago. Genocide. Genocide in Gaza, genocide in the West Bank, the persecution of Palestinians inside the Green Line, and the extension of Israel's persecution to its neighbors across Western Asia. Nothing really has changed there. It's continuing. And yet there is this massive distraction. I mean, some of that distraction is real. The U.S. is carrying out a campaign of terror against a half a dozen countries. It is threatening to attack Iran. It is sending its CIA thugs to stir up trouble in countries around the world. They are preparing, for further bloodshed. These things that are happening in U.S. cities are real. The attacks by ICE are real. Your head begins to spin at some point, and all that you're expected to stay focused on. But what it has meant in recent months is that nobody's talking about the genocide, about a Holocaust that's happening right now in our time every day, of murder, of destruction, of mass imprisonment, of torture, of rape, of starvation, of intentionally imposed disease happening right now on our watch with our tax dollars every single day, and it's not even a story. And if anyone raises it, they say, well, there's a ceasefire. It's a lie.
Right.
Peace process is a lie. The only reality right now is genocide and impunity.
You say in your piece that this is the final gasps of empire. So you see impunity, but are we also seeing the fall of the American empire?
Well, I think the American empire has been declining for a long time now. I think people inside the empire have realized that they cannot sustain their global domination, their plan of global domination. I think that explains a lot, including crazy things coming out of the White House, invasions of Venezuela, threats to take over Greenland, demands for Canada to cede its territory, and so on, is this sense that they have to kind of consolidate their position because it is just now a multipolar world, that they have a peer competitor in China, that there are other powerful countries like Russia and India and Brazil, that the BRICS are a real thing, that the Hague Group is asserting itself. So they see that the empire is in decline, but they are not, that isn't a moment for us to take a breath. They are not going down quietly. They are going down in a rampage of violence that has brought murder and mayhem, not just across Western Asia in countries like Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Yemen, but also to Africa and Somalia and in Nigeria, to Latin America, already in Venezuela, with threats against Colombia, threats against Cuba, threats against Nicaragua, and so on. All of this has shown us that they're not going down quietly, that they are on a global rampage with their Israeli partner that is extremely dangerous. That the threat, even as we may celebrate the weakening of the empire, we have to be very conscious of the fact that the threat is now existential. The U.S. is a nuclear power. Israel is a nuclear power. Both of them are armed to the teeth with 21st century weaponry as well. Both of them are fully equipped with technology that allows them to surveil all of us and to do all kinds of damage. One by one, they have picked off the opposition to their global rampage. You now have effectively a U.S.-Israel puppet regime in Syria. You have vassals running the governments in all across Western Asia, other parts of the global South. You have a Europe which is entirely obsequious and bowing to the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime. So yes, the empire is in decline. Much of the violence that we see now is a symptom of that, but they are not going down quietly. And this is a moment in history when I have said, the people living inside the belly of the beast need to stand up, need to steel themselves with courage to resist this. And the free nations of the world have to stop pretending that if they just look the other way, the monster won't come and knock on their door. It's coming for all of us. And this is a 1930s moment in history, and a moment in which the US government is very actively trying to bring back the reality of the 1930s. But if they get their wish, we're all in a lot of trouble. Both countries around the world subject to the attacks of the US-Israel axis, and those of us at home suffering from the effects of the imperial boomerang.
Thank you so much, Craig Mokhiber, for coming on the show and also for all that you do.
Thank you. Always good to be with you, Katie.
As always, I learned so much from talking to Craig Mokhiber. It's always a pleasure to talk to him, listen to his insights and analysis, and his expertise when it comes to human rights law.
And that's going to be our show. Thank you for watching Useful Idiots. Our website, again, is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.